On that note, I want to say, Ryan, I'm so glad you're here today. Our co-host guest speaker for this Hamilton Hang is Ryan Molloy. He's an interdisciplinary, I can't say that word. He's a designer and educator. And he's currently teaching graphic design at Eastern Michigan University. I really love your work here. We think it's amazing. It's a really nice looking at historic, but then seeing what letterpress can do in a contemporary manner. So we're always loving to see what you do. Let's see, you've been exhibited internationally and nationally. We have shown your work here at Hamilton for New Impressions, so that was really wonderful. And you've gotten several awards, including Art Directors Club Young Guns Award. So that's really awesome. We're glad you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
Great introduction. Thanks, Stephanie. I'm gonna jump over to the table behind me, and I think I'll let Stephanie handle the zooming and whatever needs to be done. Rather than kind of doing a screen share PowerPoint presentation, I figured I would actually just show physical objects and things that I've been making. Yeah, so I will walk back there and get started.
That's good.
All right. Okay, so I started making wood type about 4 years ago-ish, but I'm not entirely new to letterpress printing. And I figured I'd pull out something from my archives, which is this. And so this is something I produced in grad school well over 10 years ago when I was at UT Austin. And this was before David Shields got his hands on the collection of type there. And so it was kind of a mess, but also that made it less precious to a degree. And so this is a set of handbills. I would go around picking up handbills and recreating them, reprinting them. And at the time I was really interested in sort of how the screen, so the language of the screen, sort of influences print design. And so this is actually printed with heat sensitive ink and regular ink. My hands are a little cold because my basement's cold. So I don't know how long this will take, but I figured I'd pull this out because it kind of sets the context for my work nowadays. And so basically it's heat sensitive ink that if you're holding this flyer long enough, you know, a lot of this artwork kind of disappears and you get sort of the actual message. When I then left UT, I no longer had access to the wonderful Rob Roy Kelly type collection. And I largely focused on making three-dimensional type. So I had been making three-dimensional type for some time. That ultimately ended up being what led me to making wood type. And then when I jumped in headfirst to making wood type, I decided that I was going to make a chromatic typeface. So this was the first typeface that I made. And I was really interested in sort of like with the digital technology at the time that we had, how can we go about really pushing what we can do with the digital technology? I think at the time, most of like the CNC and laser printed type I had seen, still kind of focused on a little bit of like, you know, making just big type or revival type. And I was really curious, like, how could we push it? And really wanted to see what would the threshold be, and decided to do it in wood and do it in as a chromatic type, never having made type at all before. And so this is the result of that. And here's a good, like, you can kind of see some of the like line work that went into it. I was a fan of Nesbitt's Octagon, as well as the Letraset Stripes typeface. And so I kind of see this as like a marriage between the two. There were a lot of things. This typeface went through multiple revisions, ultimately kind of moved into making a second version of it. So this is the second version. You know, this is when you go from, oh, I don't have enough lines here, so I need to push the amount of lines that I can have here. And so this is sort of, you know, just some quick prints of it. it's all good. The opposite color, and then you have sort of the chromatic look of it. And then there's a ton of like alternate characters with it as well. Hopefully these are coming through. So this is, I want to say this is 15 line type to give a sense of it. There's a big gap in between making type 2 where after making this one, yeah, so these are laser cut. I just saw the comment. So these are all laser etched. And so when I was kind of teaching myself how to make type, I knew how to make cutting boards. So I glued up some end grain maple, whatever stock I could have at the time. And then, you know, using drum sanders, regular sanders, and whatever else I could do to plane it to as close as I can get to type high. I believe these were all produced on an Epilogue laser that they have at a local makerspace called MakerWorks. And so using sort of a lot of different tricks of kind of multiple passes to kind of figure out how to get it where the laser kerf doesn't destroy the line work. That took a lot of effort in figuring out. But one of the problems and challenges I had was always producing the surface and finish. Yeah, so the color overlay, this isn't the best print. My students have actually printed it. Hopefully this will be, hopefully you can see it a little bit. It's also not the best color ink. The blue is a little dark, but you kind of get a sense of it.
Yeah, we can see it nicely. That's a good way to show it. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, my students have actually printed more with this type than I have. And you know, it's one of those, it prints better on a cylinder press and on, we have an iron press at school, and just having a lot of force on it. As I was making this sort of second set, the first set, I realized I needed to learn how to make type. So I took a trip up to Jim and Jerry and Matt in Rochester. And Jerry showed me around quite a bit of how they produce their blocks and her process, which was really fantastic. So I owe a lot of thanks to figuring out how to make and sand the surface to Jerry. And little by little, I would say over the past 4 years, that's been the toughest thing, is actually making type high blocks. There you go, you could see some make ready on that one. And so these aren't, you know, these original ones, I wasn't the greatest at making the blocks yet, which always kind of presented itself to be a little problematic in printing, but overall worked out pretty nicely. From there, my membership at the makerspace that I was at was sort of waning, and I had to decide if I was going to continue on using the makerspace, paying the money, dealing with sort of those time limits that you have at makerspaces, like, oh, I only have 2 hours, and ended up kind of deciding to invest in getting a CNC router. And I kind of, as I was looking at getting a CNC router, I was looking at the Rob Roy Kelly book. In this particular typeface, the Nesbitt's Roman Grotesque. And I was always sort of fascinated by how this was kerned. And the fact that I've never seen an actual version of the blocks themselves just kind of perplexed me. And so I switched to CNC largely for this reason, so that I can make kernable type with a sort of revival of the Nesbitt Grotesque. And also, I kind of like the cleanliness of the CNC. And so this is what I call, in doing a lot of research, I learned that, so here's a quick proof of it. In doing a lot of research, it was in the Nesbitt catalog in like the 1830s, I believe. And then it also appears in a Wells catalog at another point. And then Figgins, an English type designer, had a similar version. From what I understand, these developed along the same time as like the Didos and Didone typefaces of the 1830s. And so there's this brief moment where you have these zigzags. And so you know, kind of my version and spin on it was to make a slightly more extreme version. It is 3D. So if you look at it in 3D glasses, the layers will separate as well. And so this is kind of my quick press sheet, American Midwest Kamikaze Rust blender. And so, yeah, I like this idea that, you know, we have this perception that Americans are a little bit more brash. Figgins' typeface was called English Zigzags. It was in both directions. And so I redesigned a version of a poster Bodoni, kind of used that as my base. And then after skewing it and kind of rethinking some of the proportions of some of the letters, this is the result of that. And so I don't actually have type cabinets. I have like type boxes and type drawers that don't have cabinets. And so that's some of the letters. My favorite letter of this one is the letter Q, you know, kind of in both directions. It hasn't been used. I haven't found a word yet for, or typeset anything. And then here's more of the group, the two other ones, but the S was the hardest one to design. Because I didn't actually have anything to work on or work off, figuring out, you know, how these S's would work was actually the most challenging, just kind of optically. They don't actually bend entirely at the 45-degree like an S would, but optically kind of experimenting with that. So after kind of cutting this and kind of playing around with those weird things, I still haven't seen how the original one was cut. I know the English Zigzag was just cast in a straightforward block. And I have a feeling that the Wells one that I saw, which was I think like a 6-line version, was probably also just cut in a block. And then the larger versions were just kerned by, you know, for the catalogs themselves. But I was really fascinated with that and was like, okay, what other shapes could I possibly play with in making type? And so that then led me to making type that would, you know, that had a pretty extreme sort of oblique shape, but that would also lend itself to being typeset in a really sort of funky way so that it could be somewhat dimensional. So just kind of playing with a hexagonal shape and using that as the base. It could also then be typeset, you know, in a linear fashion, depending on what you might have. And so you have, you know, the letters themselves, these 5-line little letters. They make nice little 3-dimensional cubes, but also you can then typeset, you know, in a fairly normal fashion. So this one has kind of been on the back burner a little bit just because my original attempt at this was also to make it chromatic. And so the chromatic version looks like this. Fairly normal fashion, yeah. So the chromatic version looks like this, but cutting these little tiny fine line details has been proving challenging, especially at the 5-line size that these are. So it's still in the works. It's kind of in the back burner a little bit to actually make a chromatic version. But I have almost the entirety of the character set ready to go, developed, and then it's just a matter of fabricating them. And so from there, as I was sort of playing with these things, I kept thinking about what other shapes are possible, as well as how can I expand upon this. And so started playing around with the idea of ornaments. And so we have ornaments that are also in the hexagonal pattern. And so you have these fun little ornaments that you can play around with, make patterns. Here's some kind of quick proofs of that. So sort of a basket weave kind of pattern. And then you have more of just a little bit of a gradient, more of just kind of playing around with that. And then also making 3D weird kind of structures. This was actually slightly inspired by a cross-stitch painting. I don't know if you can actually call it a painting, that a colleague of mine gave me for my birthday. And so as I was kind of staring at that in my living room, kind of the weird 3D patterns, it was like, oh, well, if I made hexagonal blocks, I could just make hexagonal textures. And then kind of playing around with sort of how do we interact with color. And so exploring sort of that sort of thing.
I think we are all picking up our jaws off the floor. I haven't seen this many all caps comments in a ham hang since we started. For Veronica Vaughn wants to know, are you cutting them to type high on a Hammond?
So I'm so everything's fabricated to type high. And so the trick to these is I actually fabricate and cut the oblique shape with the CNC. So as people were asking why the CNC, yeah, I've tried to, so I don't have a Hammond, I have a Turner Super Speed 7, but it's basically like a Hammond. And after playing around with making jigs, I found it actually easier to cut all the, well, majority of it through with the CNC. Yeah, so a 1/4 inch bit, you could go pretty deep. And then my trick is, in a lot of CNC making, you leave tabs. And so then you do some hand trimming and knock off your tabs and a little bit of cleaning up. You can kind of see maybe right here, a little bit of where like the tab might have been, and then sand it off. And so there's a little bit of kind of work in that sort of way. So yeah, the CNC kind of allows me to like really kind of have that precision, and not have to worry about fences, which then led me to kind of the next one, which is how can I push that even further? And that was, I wanted to cut things that were circular in shape. And so I made really tiny fibbly circles or quarter circles and type as a way of like thinking about, again, like what are these sort of different kind of configurations? How can we create different tessellating patterns? And, you know, this is a pretty common sort of tessellating shape. And then figuring out how to make that actually happen. Yeah, handy boxes, yeah. And so kind of figuring out how to then play around with and really push what we could do with this sort of CNC. And so this is one of those, like, there's no way my bandsaw skills would ever produce this. But having the CNC and digital fabrication technologies, you know, it makes having the ability to make circular type possible. And it has a whole set of furniture that go along with it. And so this is, again, a set itself is 5 lines, so then it's all kind of pretty modular in terms of size. And then in addition to that, there was also a set of circular ornaments, kind of riffing off on like what are the shapes and patterns you could do in terms of ornament, whether you make them, line them up, make them a border. And so some kind of quick proofs of that. This is the Starburst pattern, just printed in 2 colors on top of each other. Here it is kind of just repeated over and over. I think this is actually an earlier version of the design. I want to say, like, I cleaned up a lot of like how this part on the rays were adjusted. So there's a lot of prototyping that has gone into some of these as well. And so, and then, you know, pretty straightforward kind of wavy lines made with the sort of circular ornament pattern. The original version of these was actually this one that had a lot more detail, but they also took a lot more time to produce because of that detail. Had to move it a lot slower, and I was trying to play around with ideas of like, how can I speed up production? And so this was one of them. I also didn't really love the big heavy dot that this would produce in the center of them. And then there's some weird alignment things. So this edge here has like this one tiny little 1-point line stroke on it that's supposed to line up to that. So there's a lot of prototyping that has gone into some of these to really kind of figure out how to make them work, how to get them to work. The initial version of it, I actually cut all the way to the edge, which was just a mistake. And so I have a scrap pile of wood somewhere in my garage there. So that's sort of the circular type that might answer Brad's question, at least, why CNC? And then as I was kind of doing all this early on, after I had done the first chromatic with the lines, I was like, okay, well, I made lines. What about halftone dots? So I did some tests in terms of producing halftone dots and what a halftone chromatic might do. And so these were just some kind of quick tests using some images and playing around with CMYK color ideas, or actually red, yellow, blue ideas. And then that ultimately led to, I made some prototypes using a laser and then decided to prototype them using the CNC. And so these are CNC halftone type that just has basically 3 different directions. And then, you know, that's them overprinted, you know, just changing out the blocks so that you get this weird moire pattern. Producing halftone type on a CNC seemed really laborious, mostly because when you're using also the CNC, you can kind of let it run and do its thing, but you also have to be sort of tethered to it, especially when you're cutting these little guys. I've actually had these fly out of the CNC machine before. And so sitting there listening to a saw cut tiny little halftone dots was a little bit much for me. And I wanted to produce a full set of these. And so I ended up switching to lines. And so I re-envisioned the halftone scale in lines, kind of going in different directions. And then I produced a full font scheme of it. And so this is a full font scheme of a 6-line version of the, I don't know what we could call it, counterless chromatic type. And so, yeah, so full of just gradated lines. And you can kind of see, I have not used K and J very much. But yeah, so it goes in 8 different directions so that you can have quite a bit of combinations. I don't know if you call these things. The dots are super durable. I've put them under quite a bit of weight, as well as lines. Everything's cut in engrained maple, so it's in hopes to make it pretty strong and durable as well. And this is sort of what they look like when they're not overprinted on top of each other. And so when they're not overprinted, and I did a series of prints where I talked into my phone and mumbled as much as possible to get Siri to auto-correct the text in weird ways. And so I said a whole bunch of proverbs and idioms in, like, you know, just mumbling it, and dreamers never prosper. And so there's a whole kind of series of, I want to say 16 of these prints. My favorite one is No Game, No Fame. Every man has his vice. And you can kind of see, just as like all of the different colors interact and all of the different gradients, that visually it produces some really wild ombre and gradient effects that would be really hard to produce normally on a press. So echoes without strain, wither the norm, think and be wary, slight the man that needs you, blame is fleeting. I wish I dreamt in ombre. Will blunder, sever peace. And so some of these kind of also a little bit along the lines of content towards today, strut to the base, worst things first. So there's a whole kind of just series of these. And then, you know, very related to today's day and age politically, do not amuse me with the facts. And so that was that.
Before you move on, Ryan, I have there's a couple
Oh,
technique questions. Do you mind if I
great.
ask those now?
Okay. Go for it.
Jerry wants to know, on the shapes that go to the edge of the block, she says she'd be getting blowout with nicked corners. Does the CNC have a way to not blow out on the edge?
Occasionally I'll get blowout, but most of the time I don't. I don't know if that's just I have the speed setting adjusted at a different RPM than what I think the RPM of the pantograph runs at. I have a feeling that I'm running at a slightly slower RPM and also moving at a little bit slower rate. But I haven't gotten too much blowout on the type itself on corners usually.
Okay. And then one more question. Barb wants to know, do you plane your own wood, or is there someone, and it sounds like maybe you do, but she wants to know, is there someone out there making type high maple blocks? Or, yeah, how are you doing that process?
Yeah, no, so that's, so I'll kind of pan over. You can kind of see a block of type high maple blocks that I've got made that up. So I found a place that I can get 12-quarter wood. So kiln dried maple that's 12-quarter, which is 3 inches thick. So yeah, it's basically 12 quarters, 3 inches. And then I will take them to a table saw and cut it down to about an inch and a little over an inch. And then using a combination of the drum sander or just a belt sander, and then getting one side of the surface really flat, and then using the CNC is what I now do. I used to use the drum sander for both sides, but then I found it much more effective to use the CNC as a planer. And so making my own, I'm aimed for the 0.922 range. I found with the tiny detail, and also just not having what I think are like the perfect skills quite yet of making end grain maple type. It's getting better. I find I overshoot just a little bit. The first ones I did, I actually aimed for 0.918, but you know, like portions of it are like 0.916. Yes. Or you end up with this, you
yes.
know.
Yeah.
Painter tape.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So after kind of playing around with the chromatic versions of that typeface, I wanted to explore ways to sort of embrace. One of the wonderful things that I've loved about all of the technology is like, oh, I can almost do anything, but then at the same time, doing anything like cutting an entire, I don't know if we call it an 8A font scheme, of the, you know, gradient line typeface takes an enormous amount of time. And so I wanted something that would be a little bit more gestural, and also just kind of embracing like, oh, I only have a bit. And so I started to make some type that was loosely based on graffiti. And so this is a lot more recent work where I've been really kind of exploring, one, the type making process of like, how can I make something quickly? How can I make it on the CNC? How can I not spend hours and hours designing something? And in a lot of ways, kind of thinking about how can I cut something super quick? And so the idea here is kind of also diving back into my, you know, childhood of deviant behavior at times, playing around with graffiti throwies, you know, drawing them over a, you know, set block and then quickly cutting it. And then the result is sort of these fun little, you know, weird kind of characters. And then just setting sort of limits to that. And so everything was like, oh, well, I'm gonna just make it 15-line block and a 10-line width, and however I draw on top of it, that's what the typeface is gonna be. as a way of kind of just being really just gestural and playful with it. And so this is the result of that. Here's some of the blocks. There's a whole kind of funky set of them. These are just the ones that were used for the print. And then also just some like weird ornaments that were also sort of letter-like or type-like. I'll take that box. And so there's that. And then that sort of led to me thinking more about, okay, well, that's fun. It's gestural. I really enjoy it. It's a lot faster to cut these. But how can I make something that might not be as sort of weird and wild? And so I started down this path of still playing around with the idea of not changing a bit. So some of these typefaces, particularly like these little guys here, there's like 3-bit changes involved in it, just to get kind of the detail as well. And so in kind of like, how can I really utilize the process of the CNC, almost making it closer to the pantograph in that, like, we never change our bit. I started playing around with, you know, the idea of like what they call fluting paths. So when you're cutting on a CNC, there's an option to just cut what they call a fluting path. And so just really the whole type design is designed based on the negative shape and cutting everything out. And so this is what I started with, were these funky characters. And this is also bad type design practice. I started with A, B, and C. I probably should have started with E and O, because then when I tried to design an O based on this C, it just was a nightmare. And then also the weight of the letters I just didn't care for. And then most recently have been making another version of it. And so this is what I've been working on as of today, is producing I think this is a 12-line version of it, where it's all cut with just a single 16-inch bit, and the entire typeface is designed just for, you know, just for the bit to kind of pass through, which also makes it scalable. So these are some of the letters and some kind of quick proofs of them. And then I produced a 6-line version as well, and then kind of threw it into, like, you know, put it on the press really quick in any sort of form or fashion. And then these are what the blocks look like. I'm using the Jerry method of proofing type here, so they're still virgin. And so the blocks are these nice little kind of simple fluted forms of lines. And then the smaller blocks also have it. And the idea is that this could scale relatively easily, because all of the size and proportion is just solely based on, you know, the depth that you're cutting and or the bit that you have in your router. And so really kind of playing around with the idea of like, how can I embrace the router for what it was? And then part of me is like, oh, well, could technically be cut on a pantograph if you have the right pattern. Could do some weird sort of pantograph version of this as well. So that's what I've been up to. I feel like I talked like a mile a minute.
You did, but we were eating it all up. It was great.
Yeah. So those are what I've been up to. Here's a whole range of blocks, so you can kind of see. And these are really kind of just where it is. I guess if somebody wants dessert, there's chromatic fist bumps somewhere. I think I started with that underneath all of this, maybe somewhere in there. Oh, there is actually one thing I didn't talk about, oddly, which was what I spent most of my summer on working with last year, which was a chromatic script typeface. And I'm still trying to work out the kinks in cutting it. Yeah, encore. And so I spent a lot of time researching how, and doing all the other chromatic stuff. Part of it was also trying to really figure out, okay, well, how do I do pretty straightforward chromatic, and then how do I make a chromatic script? I was very interested in like doing something that I don't think I've ever seen before, and then I think I have seen like an Italian font that might be a chromatic script. But in the catalogs that I've seen of like US, at least wood type manufacturers, I haven't seen a chromatic script fabricated. And I tried to spend a lot of time like really trying to think about how do you make a chromatic script? And there's a reason why they probably aren't made, other than like you could really only do those shadowing effects in one direction. And so after doing a lot of troubleshooting, ended up settling on this design, and you can kind of see the prototype version of the chromatic script. It's based on the original. So if anybody is familiar with Michigan and soda, as I was researching like different chromatic scripts or just scripts in general, I came across the Faygo Cola logo. And the original Faygo logo looks a lot like that, slightly arced, but that was sort of where the inspiration was from. And then you could kind of see the chromatic letter forms there. And so, yeah. There it is up close. So, yeah, and so my goal, hopefully this summer, is to actually cut a full font of this as well. I think I saw Richard ask a question about if these are all personal experiments or something else.
Yeah, he said, are they, he said he takes it they're all personal experiments. Is there any plan to make batches for sale?
So, yes, I actually have batches for sale of what I call like my prototype sets, right? So I have batches that at some point, I have a number of sets of these, and these, along with the chromatic fist bump, which I have some of these as well. And so this past fall, I spent some time trying to figure out, which is also what led me to really kind of playing around with how can I not spend hours at the CNC, was since my day job is teaching, sometimes being a fabricator would be kind of challenging. But I did produce some sets. I sold a couple when I was at the Ann Arbor Ways Goose. I at least sold some fist bumps. I think Fritz, who runs Wolverine Press, owns a couple. And Ingrid Ankerson, who gifted me a press, also owns some fist bumps as well. But chromatic fist bumps, everybody needs them. So I did kind of fabricate some sets of these just to see, one, what does it take to actually do production out of my life. And then I had intended to fully get a shop online, but took on some client work, some freelance work, was gifted a press that I refinished, and then COVID-19 hit. And so it's in the works. And hopefully I'll have something online soon to at least sell the sets that I have now. So yeah, the type at the moment would have to be on, what is it, a bespoke commission. If somebody wanted to type, they're free to contact me and say, hey, give me that typeface. So.
Well, and that was another question. I put your link in the chat.
Right.
But Richard also wants to know, would you build digital fonts, or are they strictly for letterpress?
So everything is done in Illustrator, or in some cases, even in, what is it? I use Font Lab from time to time. I'll switch back to this multi-screen. And so everything is in Illustrator. And I do think I have some version. I actually have the chromatic script in a version of a digital version that I can type with. I don't know if I've converted the others to a version yet. The fluted one that I'm working on right now, because of like how the paths are cut, I could easily produce a digital version, but I just haven't gone through the process of it yet. Yeah. Well, that chat was blowing up, so.
It was blowing up. Yeah, we can get you a version. We can get you the chat afterwards, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely went over my 30 minutes too. So.
Oh, no. That's no problem. And this is a good time. We still have 15 minutes for questions. So I would say, if people want to unmute and ask, if you still feel like putting it in the chat, that's no problem. But this is a great time for people who, yeah, who have questions.
Oh, so Aaron, yes, I in my experimental type class, I force students to design type in all sorts of different ways. And actually, in one of the assignments, I usually make them do a chromatic sort of modular typeface that we print on the risograph, just because it's a real easy way to sort of deal with like chromatic inks or sort of that sort of translucent, transparent inks. So yeah. Other questions? There's so many people here.
There are, you've got 70 people.
Wow.
Ryan, there's
Yep.
a famous printing company in Ann Arbor called Molloy Lithography. Are you family?
I am not related. So they are Molloy, I believe, with an A. I could be wrong, but I believe they are spelled with an A. My last name's with an O. But I have met somebody who works there before, but not related.
Greg in the chat wants to know if there's a difference between creating tool paths from Illustrator versus TypeLab.
So using FontLab gives you a little bit more control of actually designing the letter forms, I feel. It's something that I've gone, like, as I've learned more about type design, I've played around with glyphs in FontLab a little bit, kind of going back and forth, but I find like you have a little bit more control over the sort of Bezier paths in there. But the sort of tool paths, what I've mostly done is I bring it into Illustrator and then import. I use vcarve to generate all my, what they call G code. And so as the CAD CAM software, I use vcarve. And so I just save it as an Illustrator file, open it up in vcarve, and usually don't have any issues. Rob knows this, that the hexagonal typeface, I call it 5-line-ish, because for some reason it cuts as like 5.1, like 5.5. It's some ridiculous, like it's like 0.5 of a point bigger than 5-line. And it drives me nuts. I can't figure out, like, I've sat there and figured out my, like, you know, I have dialed in the machine down to like, you know, thousandths of a millimeter, and I still have this sort of tiny little, you know, slight gap that for some reason those hexagonal ones I can't cut at 5-line. I don't know where the machine language is breaking down, but yeah.
Mystery that hasn't been solved.
No.
Jim wants to know, how small are you comfortable cutting? Some of the diagonals look to maybe be 3-line. Is that true?
So the smallest actual type block I've cut is 5-line, like the actual block. The smallest that I think I've actually fabricated, I don't know, I don't have my type gauge here. It's upstairs, but no, it's by the saw. So like, I think these, like that edge right there is roughly something like 5 point. And I think this is somewhere pretty small. So definitely smaller than 3-line, is what I've managed to get with the CNC. Yeah.
When you said the feet, is it like when you, the only thing I think about is like a balsa wood airplane, how like when you get a balsa wood airplane, you have to pop it out, it like holds, like has little, are those the tabs? Is that what you call them?
Those are the tabs. So I actually have some miscuts. I'll give away my secrets, or you could at least see it. So this is what it kind of looks like when it's all in and cut. So cutting all the way through, and then, you know, chisel some sandpaper as a way of getting it out of that. So it is very much like a balsa wood airplane, you know, yeah.
More secrets are being asked, Ryan. Which CNC are you using, and do you have any recommendations?
My recommendation is, if you can afford it, get a shop bot. Those things are beasts. I'm using a Millwright CNC. It's one of the like kind of build your own. It's a Millwright. I don't remember the model off the top of my head. It's sort of their middle of the line model. My biggest recommendation is get something that has the threaded rods as its moving mechanism, not something that has belts, because the belts will wear a little bit easier and they're a little less precise over time. So if you get something, I'm trying to remember, they have another name, the threaded rods, and I'm just drawing the blank on it. But that would be my recommendation, is get something that has that. That was the biggest thing for me, was kind of finding something that I wouldn't have to constantly tighten belts on and whatnot. And you still have to do machine maintenance. After kind of prototyping a whole bunch of sets, it's like, oh, now my machine is slightly like 0.1 degree, out of tramming it. And so then it's like, now I have to tram it. And the model I have to like stick little shims against my, DeWalt router. And so, yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because even when they do the pantograph work, they might have to put a copper somewhere to get that to work. So you're having the same issues no matter what era you're in. So
yeah. And so, and actually that's basically what it is. It's brasses, it's brass shims that I'm using. I could either cut them to use on the press or just stick them in my router. So yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, ball screw, yes.
We've still got a little bit. Any more questions out there?
Yeah, Rick here. How's it going?
Hey, Rick. Going pretty good.
It would be foolish for me not to just check in. You seem to be working so hard. Is it possible that you're actually, biracial? Possibly, just somehow that you're West Indian, that you have 7 jobs, that you are we related? What is going on? This is amazing.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. No, my parents are, Irish Catholic. My dad was Irish Catholic. My mom's Jewish, Polish descent. So, fairly Caucasian background. I grew up in El Paso, Texas. And so I don't know. I went to high school where out of like 2,000 people, I was one of 10 white people. So maybe that's where that might happen. So
yeah, I just want to applaud your work ethic. It's remarkable. I love the way that you basically pick your path, and then I love the pausing around trying to solve some challenges, because I can see how you wouldn't even identify the challenge until you have the physical object in your hand,
right.
And all the time, like the hardest part in experimentation tends to be just like when to stop and then start expressing a new idea, because they certainly lead to new ideas, but it's sort of like, you could glitch your brain pretty hard not stopping at times. So good job on that.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's fantastic work. I think a bunch of us are like, well, who's gonna buy that font and make something really outrageous with it? Better. But yeah, great work. Not as much a question as much a statement and just solidarity. Well done.
Awesome.
Love
that means a lot.
Mazel tov.
I don't know who wants to follow that up. Oh, go, Jim. Jim, you can.
It isn't a question either. I think your imagination is fascinating. The directions you think, well, maybe I'll try this. It's so fun to follow. So, hey, thanks. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, the next thing I kind of want to play with at some point, I'm still playing with the CNC, is to actually play around with stamping and see how the CNC could possibly be used to revitalize stamp type. So I don't know how I'm going to go about figuring that out. That might be a future sort of sabbatical proposal. Might be contacting and knocking at like Hamilton's door and being like, "Can I use your stamping machine?" So yeah.
Yeah, have you talked to Daniel Snyder before? He's our
I talked to him when I was there for the open house.
Yeah.
You know, and kind of talked to him about it. And I think I've chatted him here and there. It's fascinating that like he got the border machine working, but like as far as just the general like stamp type in general, that seems to be totally lost.
Yeah.
And so yeah, something I have in the back of my mind, but at the moment don't want to spend time researching how to CNC aluminum, how to CNC whatever I'm going to use as a kind of die for that sort of thing. And so yeah.
And if people on the Ham Hang don't know, Daniel Snyder he's actually he's up in the UP, so he's a Michigan guy. But he got our die stamping machine that makes borders here at Hamilton up and running. And so on our YouTube page, you can actually see that process as well. He's got some pieces there. It was his thesis work. So on that glowing note, I think we can say thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was absolutely amazing. I'm so glad you spoke at a million miles a minute, because it was great. It was perfect. And we're all overflowed with inspiration now.